Some mysteries are not guarded by shadows, but by walls too high for reason to scale. It begins with a locked garden where a body is found, though every gate is sealed and every key accounted for, a riddle that even the silence of dawn cannot conceal. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it? Let me know in the comments. Now, step with me past the iron gate, for the secret waits among ivy and whispers. The morning had begun with that peculiar serenity which, in our experience, so often precedes the intrusion of the extraordinary. Sunlight, pale and uncertain, filtered through the drawn curtains of our sitting room at Baker Street, illuminating the familiar disorder of books, papers, and the delicate instruments of Holmes's studies with a quiet, almost reverent radiance. I myself had taken up my pen to record some trivial observations concerning the ebb and flow of London life when the sharp ring of our doorbell shattered the calm, announcing a visitor whose urgency seemed at odds with the tranquil hour. Holmes, who had been reclining with a cigar in hand, straightened with barely perceptible alertness, and I noted the subtle shift in his expression, a mingling of curiosity and expectation. The footsteps of our guest, hurried and uncertain upon the stairs, drew my attention with a pang of anticipation, for even in the ordinary routine of our mornings, such sounds often heralded the extraordinary. Upon opening the door, we were met by a young woman of striking pallor, her slender frame trembling slightly beneath a shawl of dark wool. Her eyes, wide with apprehension, met ours in a gaze that conveyed both fear and desperation. The very air seemed to weigh upon her, and I noted with some surprise that she scarcely spoke before stepping unsteadily into the room, as though the warmth and security of Baker Street were a tentative refuge from the unseen menace she carried with her. Holmes, ever the observer, had already begun to take in minute particulars: the slightly worn heels of her boots, the delicate yet tense curve of her fingers, the faint discoloration beneath her eyes, which bespoke a night of little sleep and much anxiety. She clutched a small reticule against her chest as if it contained the last vestiges of her courage, and yet, despite her evident fear, there lingered in her expression a quiet determination, a silent entreaty that demanded attention and discernment alike. It was with difficulty that she composed herself, her voice faltering as she sought to recount the circumstances which had driven her to us. Each syllable seemed to tremble upon her lips, as if the very air of the room, warm and unthreatening though it might be, could not contain the tension she had brought from the country. She spoke of her family's estate with a mixture of reverence and apprehension, describing the sprawling gardens and the ancient walls with a precision that betrayed her intimate familiarity, yet shadowed by an almost palpable dread. Holmes leaned forward, his keen eyes fixed upon her countenance, noting the inflection of her speech, the nervous cadence of her hands as they shifted from the reticule to the edge of a chair. I could perceive, beneath the surface of her timorous narration, an anxiety which suggested that the ordinary would no longer suffice to explain the extraordinary occurrences that had compelled her journey. Her description of the estate was punctuated by hesitant pauses, each silence pregnant with unspoken fear, as though she half expected some spectral presence to emerge from the folds of her words. With a sudden catch of breath, she revealed the heart of her terror. A member of her family had been discovered lifeless within the confines of the walled garden. Her voice quavered, yet there was a note of horror which compelled our attention fully. She described the scene with trembling specificity: the pale face of the deceased, the rigid stillness of the limbs, the expression frozen in some inconceivable surprise. Holmes's gaze remained unwavering, yet I discerned a subtle tightening of his jaw, an unspoken recognition of the challenges presented by such a perplexing event. The garden, she explained, was enclosed on all sides, gates locked and windows barred. There had been no sign of disturbance, no trace of intrusion save the body itself. I found myself shivering, not at the sight, which I did not witness, but at the implications. The ordinary laws of entrance and egress had been defied, leaving a mystery that pressed upon the mind with an almost physical weight. She continued, her voice now steadier, though still tinged with an urgent disquiet. Each door and wicket had been locked, the keys accounted for with meticulous care, yet no mechanism could explain the presence of the body within the garden. Her recounting was precise, almost legalistic, and yet every syllable seemed to emphasize the impossibility that confronted us. Holmes, sitting quietly with his hands steepled, had begun to formulate his questions, yet he allowed her to speak uninterrupted, observing the manner in which she hesitated, the micro-expressions that betrayed what she did not dare to say aloud. I noted the subtle irony in her predicament. The estate, a fortress of familial security, had become the scene of a crime that mocked all conventional logic. Even as she enumerated the locked gates and unbreached boundaries, the air of unease thickened, leaving us both to ponder the mechanics of a mystery that appeared to contravene reason itself. At length Holmes intervened, his voice calm, measured and deliberate, inquiring into the minutiae of her account. He asked not only of what she had witnessed, but of what she had inferred, probing gently yet incisively into every aspect of the estate, the family, and the staff. I observed the way his eyes tracked her reactions. A flicker of the eyelid, a shift in posture, the manner in which her hands trembled ever so slightly upon the arm of her chair. She answered, sometimes hesitantly, sometimes with an urgency that belied her composure, while Holmes nodded imperceptibly, as though each detail furnished yet another thread in a tapestry of deduction not yet revealed. There was a measured, almost clinical patience in his questioning, the kind that unerringly draws forth both truth and oversight alike, and I could sense the intellectual engagement that transformed concern into strategy, terror into the fertile soil of inquiry. Finally, she cast herself into our hands with unadorned appeal, her voice carrying the urgency of one who feared further tragedy. "You must come at once," she implored, her eyes meeting Holmes's with an almost tangible desperation. Holmes, who had remained impassive throughout, allowed a subtle shift in posture, a barely perceptible signal of consent, and, without a word, it was understood that we should depart at the earliest moment for the estate in question. I noted the quiet dignity of his assent, the readiness for action that belied the calm of his demeanour, and I found myself reflecting upon the extraordinary nature of our profession, wherein the mundane act of walking to a carriage may precipitate entry into the most perilous and confounding of human mysteries. The following morning found us upon the platform of Paddington, the bustle of London receding behind us as we boarded the train bound for the countryside. The air was brisk, and though Holmes exchanged no more than a perfunctory word or two with me, I could see by the distant look in his eyes that his mind was wholly occupied with the curious problem which had been laid before us. As the engine carried us away from the labyrinth of the city, the changing landscape unfolded in measured succession. First the smoke-stained terraces of the suburbs, then open stretches of meadowland where solitary cottages lay half-hidden in copses of bare trees. I remarked upon the tranquillity of the scene, yet Holmes remained wrapped in his silent contemplations, fingers steepled and gaze fixed beyond the window, as though some unseen calculation absorbed his thoughts. His stillness, broken only by the faintest movements of his lips as he rehearsed silent reasoning, lent the journey a curious solemnity that impressed itself upon me. By early afternoon, we had reached the small country station where a waiting carriage conveyed us across winding lanes and weather-beaten hedgerows until the manor itself came into view. It was a sombre edifice, ivy-clad from its foundations to its chimneys, and surrounded by grounds that bore little of the gaiety usually associated with country life. Most striking of all, at the very heart of the estate, rose the high enclosure of the garden about which we had heard so much. Its walls, sombre and imposing, seemed less the adornment of a noble house than the barrier of a prison, and even from the road the heavy iron gate could be discerned standing shut as if in perpetual defiance of intrusion. The chill of the air seemed to deepen as we drew nearer, and though the afternoon sun cast its rays upon the windows of the manor, they reflected a cold and cheerless light, as though the place had resigned itself to secrecy. When at last we alighted, I found myself unable to withhold a shudder at the aspect of the walled enclosure. The stone was dark with age, moss clinging to its surface in ragged patches that resembled the very decay of time itself. Rust had bitten deep into the fastenings of the gates, yet the locks gleamed with a polish that bespoke constant attention and vigilance. Their incongruous brightness suggested that, though old in structure, these barriers were maintained with deliberate care, as if to guard not merely against the intrusion of strangers, but against some dread of escape. I placed my hand upon the cold metal of one such gate and felt, in that touch, the unnatural chill of imprisonment. It was as though the garden within had been sealed not only against the world of the living, but also against the cleansing breath of heaven's air. Holmes, meanwhile, regarded the barriers with a concentration that betrayed no emotion, though I could not but feel that the weight of the walls pressed heavily upon my very spirit. We were received at the manor by a staff, whose manner could only be described as furtive. Their eyes shifted constantly, their words delivered in hushed tones, as though even the air of the place demanded secrecy. One elderly maid, in answer to a casual inquiry, crossed herself nervously and muttered of strange sounds that had issued from the garden on the night of the death. Low rustlings, a metallic scrape, and a sudden silence more dreadful than any noise. Another spoke of a family curse, whispered through generations, that no member should linger long within the confines of that fateful plot. Their accounts, delivered with trembling voices, were full of half-formed terrors rather than facts, yet the unanimity of their fear impressed itself upon me. Holmes listened with an air of polite indifference, yet I knew well that not a syllable escaped his keen hearing, and that he would weigh each detail, however trivial, in his secret scales of reason. We proceeded into the grounds, and I was struck at once by the oppressive stillness that seemed to hang over them. The breeze had died, the trees stood motionless, and even the birds appeared to avoid the place, leaving only an unnatural silence that pressed upon the ear. The scent of damp earth mingled with the faint odour of withering vegetation, creating an atmosphere more funereal than pastoral. Here and there, the once cultivated paths bore signs of neglect. Weeds thrust their way through the gravel, and beds which might once have held roses now lay barren, or worse, half strangled by the remnants of their former growth. It was a silence not of rest, but of abandonment, as though life itself had recoiled from some unspoken horror. I confess that I found myself glancing more than once over my shoulder, as if expecting to find eyes upon us from within the shuttered windows of the house. Holmes, however, displayed none of my unease, but rather moved with measured step about the perimeter of the walls. He paused frequently to inspect some triviality: a fleck of soil displaced at the base of the stone, a faint scrape upon the iron fastening, the manner in which the ivy climbed and clung to the ancient surface. At one point, he stooped to examine a depression in the gravel, taking out his magnifying lens and remaining there so long that I began to grow restless. Rising, he brushed his hands deliberately and fixed his gaze upon the locks with an intensity that suggested not curiosity, but recognition. Yet he remained silent, and when I ventured a question, he merely raised a finger in gentle rebuke, as if to caution me that his conclusions were not yet ripe for utterance. His eyes, bright and searching, conveyed a concentration so complete that I could not doubt he was already tracing, in the labyrinth of his mind, the lines of a theory. It was as the shadows lengthened across the lawn and dusk began to gather that Holmes at last beckoned me quietly toward a corner of the wall where the ivy grew in thick profusion. He pointed, without a word, to some faint irregularity upon the stone, so slight that my untrained eye could scarcely discern it. Yet his countenance bore the expression of one who had found a fragment of hidden truth. "The matter deepens, Watson," he murmured, in a tone scarcely above a whisper, and with that enigmatic remark turned once more to the gate, leaving me to ponder in silence the meaning of what we had seen and what it might portend for the mystery of the locked garden. At Holmes's request, the great key was produced, and with a groan of rusted iron, the gate to the walled garden swung back upon its hinges. I confess that the sound seemed to me less an opening than an intrusion, as though we had crossed some threshold which nature herself had long forbidden. The air within was stagnant, touched with the odour of damp vegetation, and carried a stillness so complete that each movement of our feet upon the gravel seemed a profanation. Holmes, ever deliberate, entered without a glance to right or left, but I, less immune to such impressions, felt a curious oppression steal over me, as if the high walls had pressed the very sky from view. There was a sombre hush that lay not only upon the trees and flowers but upon the spirit itself, and I could not escape the conviction that this enclosed ground was less a garden of life than a silent stage upon which some dark and final act had been performed. It was there, upon a patch of trampled grass between two neglected flower beds, that the figure of the deceased lay stretched in pitiful contrast to the order once intended for this place. I approached with that mingling of dread and professional instinct which has so often attended my experiences, and bent to observe the body more closely. The limbs, though at first disposed in seeming calm, bore slight contortions that spoke of a struggle swiftly ended. The hands were clenched, yet one retained a faint trace of soil, as though it had clawed the earth in some final exertion. The features, pallid and rigid, bore an expression that defied easy description, not wholly terror, not wholly peace, but rather a mask of astonishment frozen by death itself. A single fallen bloom rested against the sleeve of the coat, lending to the grim tableau a touch of mockery that no artifice of man could have devised. I confess that a chill crept along my spine as I straightened, for the silence of the garden seemed to deepen in sympathy with the silence of the grave. Holmes had already stooped to examine the ground, his keen eye noting details which my own could scarcely perceive. At his gesture, I observed faint impressions in the soil, subtle depressions where the earth had yielded beneath weight, though their direction and shape resisted my comprehension. Broken stems of grass lay bent in patterns inconsistent with a single fall, as though some further movement had followed the fatal collapse. Holmes traced these signs with the tip of his cane, pausing now and then with an expression of absorbed calculation. "You perceive, Watson," he murmured. "The difficulty is not that there are no traces, but that they speak two languages at once." I could discern in his remark the hint of contradiction, as if the very earth had recorded a presence denied by the impregnable walls. The notion of invisible steps moving in this silent place unnerved me, yet I held my peace, content to watch the master at work. Near the far corner of the enclosure, Holmes halted abruptly before a rosebush whose once graceful form had been violently disturbed. One of its stems lay snapped at a sharp angle, the fracture fresh, the bloom already drooping from its forced severance. He examined it with the utmost care, brushing gently at the surrounding leaves as though they concealed a secret. I followed his gaze but could perceive nothing beyond the damage itself, which seemed to me a natural consequence of some hurried step or desperate struggle. Yet Holmes lingered long upon it, crouching to observe the angle of the break and the manner in which the thorned branches had been displaced. A faint smile touched his lips, quickly suppressed, and he straightened without a word. "Curious," was all he permitted himself, and he moved on, leaving me in greater perplexity than before. That a broken flower could hold significance equal to human testimony seemed inconceivable, yet I had learned often enough that in Holmes's hands the smallest fragment might outweigh the largest assertion. Our inspection then turned to the gates and fastenings that hemmed us in. One by one they were tried, and I saw with my own eyes the truth of what our client had so earnestly declared. There was no sign of violence upon them. The locks were intact, the metal unscarred, and each mechanism turned smoothly to the appointed key. The bolts, too, bore no mark of undue pressure, nor was there any splinter upon the woodwork to suggest intrusion. Holmes lingered over each fastening with his lens, scrutinizing edges, hinges, and bars, yet nothing rewarded his search save the confirmation of their inviolability. I could not repress the exclamation that rose to my lips. It is as though death itself had passed through stone. Holmes made no reply, though I saw the flicker of amusement in his eye, as if the paradox rather than dismaying him, had but sharpened the relish with which he pursued the enigma. Holmes now bent himself to his work with that absorption which I had come to recognize as the prelude to discovery. He measured distances between the faint soil marks with a small tape drawn from his pocket, recorded the angle of the broken stems, and even took fragments of earth into an envelope for later analysis. I observed the precision with which he noted each feature, his lips moving inaudibly as though conducting a dialogue with the silent witnesses around him. His figure, bent low against the fading light, seemed almost spectral in its intentness, and the air of the garden grew heavier with each passing moment. I ventured to ask if he discerned a path forward, but he lifted a hand for silence and continued his delicate examination. There was in his countenance that rare expression which told me his mind was engaged to the utmost, a look of deep intensity, unsoftened by doubt, yet not yet yielding to triumph. At length, when the light had waned to the edge of dusk, Holmes rose and dusted his hands with deliberate care. "There is," he said softly, "an element which no eye has yet considered, though it lies plain enough before us." He offered no further explanation, but his glance rested once more upon the ivy-covered wall, and in that look I read the conviction of one who has glimpsed the thread within the labyrinth. With a brief nod, he indicated that our examination was concluded for the moment, and we withdrew, the oppressive silence of the garden following us even beyond its gate. I was left with a sense not of closure but of awakening, as though the ground we had trodden still concealed voices that only Holmes could interpret. My perplexity deepened, but with it my faith that the shadows gathering round the locked garden would, in time, yield to the relentless clarity of his reason. Holmes's request that the principal members of the household assemble was received with visible reluctance, yet none dared disobey. One by one they entered the sombre withdrawing room, each carrying the peculiar stiffness of those who feel themselves under silent accusation. The air was thick with unease, the shuffling of feet and the occasional cough marking the tension of the moment. I observed, with the medical instinct that still clings to me, that several of the faces were pale with want of sleep, and the hands of more than one betrayed a tremor beyond ordinary agitation. Holmes remained composed, seated with his back to the fire, his eyes half-lidded, yet never unwatchful. There was no dramatic gesture, no stern proclamation, but his very stillness seemed to impress upon them that truth, however concealed, would presently be summoned forth. At Holmes's bidding, the gardener was brought forward. He was a sturdy man by build, yet his roughened hands twitched as he clasped and unclasped his cap. He admitted without hesitation that he had been working in the vicinity of the walled garden on the morning in question, trimming hedges and preparing soil for the spring season. Yet, when pressed for particulars, his replies grew hesitant, as though each word required labour. He spoke of hearing nothing unusual, but his shifting eyes and the moisture upon his brow suggested a mind ill at ease. Holmes, in his gentle fashion, inquired whether he had noticed the locks disturbed or the ivy displaced. To each, he returned a swift denial, though the haste of his protestations struck me as suspicious. It was evident, at least to my untutored observation, that the man concealed either ignorance or guilt, though Holmes's composed demeanour betrayed neither acceptance nor rejection of the tale. From another of the staff, we heard a story that cast suspicion in yet another direction. A maidservant, her voice hushed and her eyes darting nervously toward her companions, recounted how a footman, lately dismissed for insolence and intemperance, had been seen loitering about the grounds during the days preceding the calamity. His dismissal had not been amicable, and there was talk of muttered threats, overheard in taverns, against both the family and those who had contrived his removal. On the night before the tragedy, a shadowy figure had been glimpsed near the carriage house, though none could swear to its identity. The implication was plain enough that resentment, sharpened by drink and dismissal, might have driven the man to some desperate act of revenge. Holmes listened gravely, his fingers lightly drumming upon the arm of his chair. while the shifting of eyes and murmured assent from the assembled domestics seemed to confirm their belief in this darker possibility. More disturbing still were the murmurs that turned suspicion toward our own client. A footman, emboldened by Holmes's questioning, hinted that the young lady herself had been seen in the garden at twilight in conversation with the deceased. Another, with a sidelong glance, muttered that affection and quarrel are close companions, and who could say what words had passed between them in that secluded space? Though their statements were cautious and delivered without certainty, the effect upon the company was palpable. I glanced at Holmes, who betrayed no movement beyond the sharpening of his gaze, yet in myself I felt a pang of disquiet, for the possibility that the anxious visitor who had sought our aid might herself be entangled in the mystery seemed intolerable. The household, however, appeared to entertain the thought with a mixture of fear and fascination, as though the notion of guilt lying within the family lent the tragedy its most compelling sting. As the questioning continued, contradictions began to emerge with a frequency that bewildered me. One asserted that the sound of footsteps had been heard upon the gravel path at an hour when another swore the household was locked in slumber. A maid insisted that a lantern had flickered near the garden wall, while her fellow denied with vehemence that any light had been seen. Times were misstated, movements confused, and motives hinted at without conclusion. It was as though each witness, in fear or malice, sought either to conceal or to embroider, leaving the truth entangled in a skein of human error. Beneath it all ran darker undercurrents, rivalries among the servants, jealousies long hidden, and resentments too carefully suppressed. I confess that I grew perplexed and disheartened, for it seemed to me that every word carried us further from clarity and deeper into a maze of suspicion, where each turning promised only further doubt. Holmes, however, displayed none of my discouragement. While the voices rose and faltered, he sat with unruffled calm, his pencil moving now and again across a small notebook which he kept half hidden upon his knee. At times he raised his eyes with a look of peculiar intensity, fixing upon the speaker in a manner that seemed to penetrate the very recesses of conscience. Yet he asked no more than a question or two, brief, precise, and sufficient to test the consistency of a statement. The contrast between his composure and the growing agitation of the household was so marked that I marvelled anew at the discipline of his faculties. I, who felt lost amid contradictions, could not but wonder if Holmes discerned within the tangled accounts the faint line of truth that to me remained invisible. When at last the company was dismissed, a heavy silence settled over the room. Holmes closed his notebook, rose with deliberation, and remarked in a tone of quiet conviction, "There lies among these statements one small inconsistency, trifling to the eye, yet vital to the truth. Upon that single thread may depend the unravelling of the whole." His words fell with a weight that left the assembled servants exchanging uneasy glances, as though the shadow of guilt had brushed each in turn. He offered no further explanation, and with that enigmatic declaration the household dispersed, leaving me in perplexity and with a sense that the mystery had but deepened rather than cleared. Holmes laid out his instructions with characteristic precision. We were to maintain absolute silence, to speak only in whispers, and to observe with eyes and ears sharpened against every trifling sound or movement. He carried with him a small case containing certain instruments which he did not trouble himself to explain, and his manner was so calm, so resolutely practical, that I found my own apprehension heightened in proportion. Our arrangements were made without the knowledge of the household, save for our anxious client, who looked upon us with a mixture of dread and hope as we stepped out into the chill night air. Holmes pressed my arm lightly as we approached the gate. "Courage and patience, Watson. It is in the long hours of quiet waiting that the truth most often reveals itself." With those words, we entered the garden once more, and I felt as though we had crossed into a theatre of shadows, where every leaf might conceal an enemy. The moon hung pale and full above the enclosure, casting its cold beams upon the walls so that the ivy gleamed like silver thread. We took our places behind a low shrub at the margin of the path, where we might command a view of the gates without ourselves being seen. The garden was hushed to a degree that oppressed the spirit. Even the stir of the branches seemed arrested, as though nature herself held her breath. The shadows lay deep upon the gravel walks, stretching in grotesque shapes that shifted with every faint stirring of the night breeze. I found my gaze continually drawn to the figure of Holmes, who sat erect, motionless as stone, his eyes fixed with unwavering intensity upon the ironwork of the nearest gate. For myself, though I strove to emulate his composure, the uncanny beauty of that moonlit enclosure stirred in me a sense of foreboding, which I could not wholly overcome. The hours crept by with a slowness that mocked the very passage of time. The silence became a tangible presence, pressing upon the ears until the smallest sound seemed an intrusion of vast significance. I felt the cold creep through my limbs and an increasing heaviness in my eyelids, yet beside me Holmes remained tireless, his figure rigid, his attention absolute. My mind wandered, conjuring images of the lifeless form we had seen stretched upon this very ground, and I could not resist the thought that death still lingered here as an unseen sentinel. At intervals I glanced at my companion, hoping for some sign of progress, but his expression betrayed neither fatigue nor impatience, only that inscrutable calm, which both reassured and mystified me. The contrast between my restless dread and his silent vigilance grew so marked that I marvelled at the difference between his iron discipline and my human weakness. It was close upon midnight when the silence was at last disturbed. A faint scraping reached my ears, so slight that I at first attributed it to imagination, yet the fixed gleam in Holmes's eyes told me that he too had marked it. The sound came again, a stealthy rustle, followed by the distinct crack of a twig beneath some hidden pressure. My heart beat violently, and I found myself leaning forward, straining my senses to the utmost. The noises were intermittent, suggestive less of a single purposeful step than of something groping, uncertain, and yet sinister. Once there came a low metallic clink, such as a tool might make when striking stone, and it was succeeded by a silence deeper than before, as though the very night conspired to cloak the trespasser. I confess that a chill of unreasoning dread swept over me, and for the first time the thought of some unearthly presence intruded upon my reason. My strained gaze fastened upon the far wall, where the ivy lay heavy in dark festoons. There, surely as I live, I perceived the faintest tremor, a shifting as of some figure half hidden among the leaves. The movement was so fleeting that I questioned my senses, yet its effect upon my imagination was profound. The pale light seemed to weave ghostly shapes upon the wall, and for a moment I felt as though some spectral intruder moved within that haunted enclosure. I caught my breath, and in the silence that followed, the beating of my own heart was loud in my ears. My hand strayed involuntarily toward my revolver, though I hesitated to draw it, torn between fear of some phantom and the absurdity of preparing against shadows. Yet still, I watched the ivy with feverish intensity, certain that its secret stir concealed more than the idle play of wind. Even as my agitation mounted, Holmes's hand came lightly upon my sleeve. He made no sound, but the pressure of his fingers and the sudden narrowing of his gaze conveyed a clear command to remain still. His eyes were riveted upon some minute feature which I, for all my straining, could not distinguish. There was in his bearing a quiet certainty, an air of one who perceives what lies hidden to common vision. My impulse to speak or act was checked by the calm authority of his presence, and I sat frozen, my senses alert, yet unable to penetrate the veil which his keener intellect had already pierced. That long moment of enforced silence seemed interminable, yet I knew that to disobey his unspoken order would be to imperil the very success of our watch. At length, the paling of the eastern sky told us that dawn was near. No intruder had appeared, the gates remained unbroken, and the garden lay as silent as when we entered. Holmes rose, stretching his limbs with the ease of one unwearied, and cast upon me a glance in which I detected quiet satisfaction. He offered no explanation, only a murmured, "Enough for tonight, Watson," before turning toward the house. I followed in silence, baffled and uneasy, yet convinced that he carried within his mind some conclusion which I, in my perplexity, could not yet discern. When at last the household had dispersed, Holmes drew me quietly aside into the library, closing the door with deliberate care. His face, habitually impassive, bore that rare look of suppressed animation which I had come to recognize as the prelude to important disclosure. "Watson," he murmured, lowering his voice to a confidential tone, "there are threads in this tangle which no eye but ours must yet perceive. Until the hour is ripe, discretion is imperative." He fixed me with a keen glance, as if to impress upon me the weight of silence, and I assured him of my fidelity. He then turned his gaze to the window where the garden walls loomed faintly in the twilight, and I could almost feel the current of his mind pressing forward, drawing together scattered fragments of truth into a shape still invisible to me. Holmes's hand dipped into his pocket, and he produced a small iron key which he laid upon the table before us. "Observe, Watson," he said, his eyes gleaming. This was discovered not upon the person of the keeper, nor among the usual household repositories, but half buried in a corner of the stable yard, where chance alone might never have placed it. I bent to examine it, noting its sturdy construction and the faint trace of rust about the wards. Holmes continued, "It corresponds to none of the locks in common use within the house, yet it matches precisely the design of the lesser gate to the garden enclosure. How comes it, then, to be cast aside in so unlikely a place? A lock whose key is found elsewhere speaks as loudly as a door left ajar, and its voice tells us of concealment, subterfuge, and an unseen hand." His tone was calm, but the import of his words carried a force that stirred my imagination profoundly. We returned once more to the enclosure, where Holmes bade me examine closely a patch of soil near the eastern wall. At first, I could discern nothing beyond the irregularities natural to such ground, but under his direction I perceived the faint impressions of feet, neither wholly clear nor wholly effaced. They were smaller than those of the gardener, and their pattern betrayed a refinement inconsistent with heavy labour. Yet what struck me most was the direction. They appeared to lead not toward the gate, but away from it, and then ceased abruptly, as though the walker had vanished into the very air. Holmes crouched, measuring the distances with his lens and compass, murmuring occasional exclamations under his breath. "Here, Watson," he said at length, "is the paradox. The soil records a presence which the locked fastenings deny. We stand, therefore, in the presence of duplicity, either in stone or in man." I confess that the riddle pressed heavily upon me, for the earth itself seemed to conspire with the walls to mock our reason. Holmes's gaze next travelled to the thick mantle of ivy that clung to the wall with stubborn persistence. With infinite care, he parted the leaves, and there, half concealed by the foliage, he pointed to a faint abrasion upon the stone. "A mark, Watson, small, yet eloquent. Note how the ivy is bruised, how the stem is torn where a hand or foot may have pressed." He reached further, and from the dense green he drew forth a tiny object, a fragment of lace, pale and delicate, such as might adorn the attire of a woman. I could not repress an exclamation, but Holmes silenced me with a glance. He examined it with his lens, then folded it away in his notebook. "There is no need for conjecture," he said softly. "The wall, the ivy, the key, each supplies its own testimony. What we require now is patience to let these whispers combine into a single voice." The moonlight fell coldly upon the wall, and I felt the oppressive stillness of the garden deepen, as though the very plants shared in our discovery. As we withdrew from the enclosure, Holmes's voice took on a tone of quiet satisfaction. "Consider, Watson, a key misplaced where no honest hand would leave it, footprints that end where solid wall should forbid, continuation, and a trace upon the ivy that tells of a surreptitious passage. These are no isolated fragments, but links in a single chain. Our problem is not of supernatural visitation, nor of chance, but of deliberate contrivance by a human mind both cunning and unscrupulous. You may not yet perceive the entire design, but rest assured that the pattern has begun to declare itself. I followed his reasoning with eager attention, yet the ultimate picture eluded me, and I marveled anew at his ability to discern coherence where to me all was still confusion. Holmes paused upon the path, his features grave. And yet, Watson, though the outline grows clearer, we dare not act with precipitancy. An error of judgment, a word spoken too soon, may drive our quarry to flight, or worse, precipitate further calamity. The mind that conceived this stratagem is one not to be underestimated. We must proceed with the utmost caution and strike only when the web is fully woven. His words impressed me with a sense of danger more immediate than before, for it seemed that we stood not merely in pursuit of truth, but on the edge of some trap that might yet close upon ourselves as well as upon the guilty. As we neared the house once more, Holmes's lips curved in that faint smile which told me his mind was already a step ahead. "There remains but one course, Watson," he said. "We must lay a snare more subtle than that which has been devised against others. The garden has told us part of its secret. Tomorrow night, I trust it shall reveal the whole." He offered no further explanation, but the gleam in his eye and the measured certainty of his step assured me that he had already conceived the plan by which the mystery would be brought to light. At Holmes's request, the household was assembled in the sombre drawing-room, the heavy curtains drawn against the encroaching dusk. There was in the air that peculiar hush which precedes a storm, a tension palpable in every whispered breath and nervous glance. Our anxious client sat apart, her hands clasped tightly together, her gaze shifting restlessly from Holmes to the faces of her companions. The servants grouped themselves uneasily near the door, their eyes betraying dread curiosity, while the master of the house stood rigid by the mantel, as if bracing himself against revelation. Holmes occupied a central position, his figure erect, his manner calm, his keen grey eyes moving from one to another with the steady assurance of command. I, who had witnessed many such scenes, felt again the strange solemnity of that moment, when truth hovers on the threshold, and men await its entrance with mingled hope and fear. Holmes began without flourish, his voice low yet distinct, carrying to every corner of the room. "The enigma of the locked garden," said he, "has rested not upon the absence of evidence, but upon its misinterpretation. Let us review the facts." He spoke of the key, discovered in the stable-yard, where no honest chance could have placed it. A garden securely locked is no mystery when the key is in trustworthy hands. But when the key is misplaced, nay, deliberately discarded, the mystery lies not in the barrier, but in the deceit. He then turned to the footprints, delicate impressions upon the soil that contradicted the apparent solitude of the enclosure. These faint traces spoke of an unseen visitor, one whose movements ceased where the wall begins, until we discover the ivy bruised and torn. From his notebook, he produced the fragment of lace, holding it briefly aloft before returning it to safety. Here lies the testimony of the garden itself: key, footprints, and ivy, each a whisper, together a chorus. His manner was precise, almost clinical, yet the mounting suspense among his listeners gave his measured recital the weight of revelation. Holmes's voice grew firmer as he proceeded. The death within the locked garden was no accident, no visitation of curse or fate. It was the work of human cunning, cloaked by circumstance and sealed by design. Consider the walls, high yet not insurmountable, clothed in ivy, which serves as ladder to one agile and desperate. Consider the key, discarded, not lost, placed where suspicion would not naturally fall. Consider the body itself, its position, the signs of struggle, the disturbed earth. All speak of a life extinguished within that enclosure, but not in the manner we were meant to believe. He paused, allowing his gaze to sweep the company, who sat transfixed in fearful silence. "The crime was staged, my friends, to convey impossibility, to make you believe that death had entered where no living soul might pass. But there is no locked chamber in nature which the hand of man, if sufficiently driven, cannot contrive to penetrate. The very impossibility was the mask beneath which lay the hand of the murderer. There followed a pause so charged that the ticking of the clock upon the mantel seemed thunderous. Holmes's eyes fixed suddenly upon one among us, and his voice cut the silence with the precision of a blade. "You, sir, were the architect of this deception." He named the culprit, and a murmur of incredulity passed through the room. The accused, who had maintained an outward composure, faltered visibly beneath the weight of Holmes's gaze. "Jealousy, the most corrosive of passions, was your motive. The victim's inheritance, the affections denied you, and the sense of being slighted, these conspired to harden your heart to murder. You scaled the wall by means of the ivy, you entered the garden by stealth, and you arranged the scene to suggest a death wrought by fate itself. But fate leaves no broken rosebush in its train, nor does chance mislay a key where only guilt would wish it hidden." The company recoiled, some with gasps, others with cries, but Holmes stood unshaken, his words delivering both accusation and conviction in the same breath. The man, pale and trembling, rose unsteadily, his lips forming denials that swiftly gave way beneath the unyielding pressure of evidence. His confession, once begun, flowed forth with reluctant clarity, as if the very act of speech had loosened the grip of secrecy. He told of his long-standing resentment, of the bitter quarrels, and of the opportunity seized when chance presented itself. He had secured a duplicate key, had timed his movements so that no eye might see, and had scaled the ivy-clad wall with a dexterity born of desperation. The struggle in the garden had been brief. A single blow, a fall upon the earth, and all was over. In haste he had sought to render the scene inexplicable, misplacing the key, disturbing the ground, and retreating over the wall to leave behind the illusion of an impenetrable mystery. His voice broke at intervals with sobs, yet in its substance his account confirmed with grim accuracy the deductions Holmes had laid before us. I could not but feel a chill as I listened, for the cold logic of crime had seldom been so nakedly exposed. The effect upon the company was profound. Our client, white-faced and trembling, sank into her chair with a cry of mingled horror and relief. The servants exchanged glances of astonishment, their whispers swelling into murmurs of indignation and pity. The master of the house covered his face with his hands, overwhelmed by the revelation that treachery had lurked so near. There was in the air a strange mingling of grief for the dead, anger toward the guilty, and gratitude that the terror of the unknown had at last been dispelled. Yet I noted, too, the peculiar calm with which Holmes regarded the scene, as though the storm of human passion was but another phenomenon to be observed, recorded, and understood. When at last the tumult had subsided, Holmes addressed us with quiet gravity. "You see, my friends, how frail are the barriers of honour when gnawed by envy, and how cunning will ever seek refuge in the semblance of impossibility. The locked garden was but a stage, the walls but curtains behind which guilt sought to conceal itself. Man ever believes that his devices are impregnable, yet nature and reason conspire to betray him." He turned to me with a faint smile, half ironical, half melancholy. "It is the old story, Watson. Human folly dressing itself in mystery, and human passion finding in secrecy its most dangerous ally. Our task is only to listen, for the earth itself will speak when men strive most to silence it." With that, he fell into silence, leaving each of us to reflect upon the strange interweaving of pride, envy, and fate that had brought such tragedy within the walls of that silent garden. The first light of day crept slowly over the estate, softening the stern outlines of the garden walls and touching the ivy with a pale gleam. The oppressive air of the preceding nights seemed momentarily lifted, yet there lingered about the place a solemnity which no sunshine could wholly dispel. From my vantage at the chamber window, I watched as the mist curled upward from the damp earth, wreathing the enclosure in a veil that seemed at once concealing and revealing. It was a morning of tranquility, yet its very calm bore the memory of violence, and the stillness appeared more haunting than peaceful. The garden, so lately the stage of terror and deceit, lay silent, as though exhausted by its own secrets. Holmes joined me presently, his step light, his countenance composed but reflective. "Observe, Watson," he said, his gaze upon the paling sky, "how swiftly nature reasserts herself. To her, a human life is but a breath upon the glass, wiped away in an instant, leaving the surface clear once more." There was in his tone no cruelty, but a cool irony that revealed his habitual detachment from the passions which had driven the crime. Jealousy, pride, covetousness. What mighty engines these appear in the mind of man, and yet how feeble when measured against the immutable laws of truth. A key misplaced, a rosebush broken, a trace upon the soil. Such trifles overthrow stratagems conceived in secrecy and carried out with desperation. It is the irony of folly, Watson, that it seeks to mask itself in impossibility, and thereby betrays itself the more surely. He spoke not for applause, but as one reciting to himself a lesson written plainly in the book of human frailty. As the morning advanced, I moved among the household, who were by turns subdued and inquisitive. The servants spoke in hushed voices, some still trembling from the shock of revelation, others eager to recount each detail of their own narrow connection with the affair. Their relief was evident, though tempered by a lingering fear of what had transpired so close at hand. Our client, though pale and visibly shaken, expressed her gratitude with a sincerity that touched me. Yet beneath her words, I detected a residue of dread, as though she could scarcely reconcile the safety of her home with the memory of its recent violation. Even the master of the house, stern and dignified, seemed chastened by the knowledge that evil had walked so near and worn a familiar face. It was clear that though the immediate danger had passed, the shadow of suspicion and betrayal would haunt those walls for many days to come. Later, we walked once more within the enclosure, and I could not help but view its silent features with a heightened awareness. The faint indentations in the soil, half effaced by the night's damp, spoke of stealthy steps that had trespassed where none should tread. A broken twig, insignificant in itself, seemed a mute witness to hurried flight. The rosebush, still bearing its cruelly snapped branch, stood as a monument to the violent act that had been cloaked in secrecy. Even the ivy, stirred gently by the breeze, whispered of its unwilling part in the drama. Holmes paused here and there, pointing out these traces with a composure that belied their grim significance. To me, each small sign was laden with memory, for I could not detach them from the image of the lifeless form once stretched upon this ground. The garden, once merely still, had become eloquent, its silence no longer ignorance, but testimony. Holmes, observing my preoccupation, spoke with a softened gravity. "It is well, Watson, to remember that crime is rarely born of monstrous design. More often it springs from the ordinary passions of men. Jealousy, resentment, ambition, raised by circumstance to fatal intensity. The locked garden was no miracle, no curse, but a stage contrived by human hands to conceal human guilt. And yet, what a hold such illusions have upon us, until reason strips them bare." His words carried that peculiar blend of detachment and irony which so often cloaked his deeper reflections, leaving me to ponder whether he spoke in censure of the culprit or of the weakness of mankind as a whole. For myself, the experience left an impression both sombre and profound. The eerie beauty of the estate, its silence so charged with memory, seemed to cling to the senses long after the facts had been laid bare. I reflected upon the courage of our client, the frailty of those who had trembled under suspicion, and the relentless acuity of my companion, whose mind could extract order from chaos with an ease that left me in perpetual admiration. Yet I also felt the weight of melancholy, for in every triumph of reason there lay the reminder that such triumph is won upon the ruins of human error and suffering. The garden, to me, would never again be a place of repose, but rather a symbol of the shadow which passion may cast upon even the fairest ground. As we prepared at last to depart, I cast one final glance toward the enclosure. The sunlight now lay warmly upon its walls, the ivy stirred gently, and the air seemed cleansed of its former oppression. Yet beneath that serenity lingered the memory of the night's revelations, a reminder that no wall, however high, can wholly exclude the darker impulses of mankind. Holmes, following my gaze, allowed the faintest smile to touch his lips. "Ah, Watson," he said, "the locked garden has yielded its secret, but not, I think, its moral. That, as ever, remains for each to discover in his own conscience." With that quiet, almost ironic remark, he turned toward the waiting carriage, leaving me to follow in thoughtful silence, while the garden behind us seemed to brood upon its own dark history beneath the morning sun. Holmes and I lingered a moment longer at the carriage gate, the morning sun glancing upon the ivy that had so nearly concealed a murderer's passage. He drew his cloak about him and said quietly, "You see, Watson, the locked garden was never secure against cunning hands. It is not barriers of stone that fail us, but the frailty of human honesty. Where envy takes root, even the stoutest wall may crumble. And now I put a question to you. What do you think was the criminal's greatest error? His mislaid key, his broken rosebush, or the flaw in his very nature? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this tale, I invite you to subscribe for more mysteries and share this story with those who delight in the shadowed art of deduction.